I'm going to show you how to turn this into this. I'm going to teach you how to make a professional sounding, deep, progressive, organic drum loop. At the end of the video, I saved my best tip for last, so make sure to watch all the way through. It's a tip that got me from an amateur producer to a professional producer when dealing with drums. If you want the project file, click the link in the description below to go to my Patreon where you can grab this file and tons of other Ableton project files. Make sure to subscribe. Let's get into the video. This is my basic drum loop. Nothing to write home about, it's pretty basic, but I'm gonna show you 5 things in 5 steps that you can do to elevate this progressive house drum loop to feel much more professional and high quality. We'll start with foundation and hooks, creating a nice strong hook foundation so it's nice and groovy from the get-go. Number 2 is secondary hook, adding some complementary hooks to help the groove of the original foundation hook. Number 3 is going to be adding swing, making that track feel more humanized and realistic and more ear-pleasing. Number 4 is ear candy, and it might not be what you think, so you're gonna have to stick around to find out. Number 5 is going to be some mixing tips and techniques that you absolutely should be doing to get the most quality out of your drum loops. Let's get started. Number 1 is going to be foundation, groove, and hooks. Groove is the most important aspect of dance music. So we want to make sure that our drum loop has a lot of groove. It's creating that sense of danceability. And I'm going to show you some things that you can do right away to do that. First thing, again, I have my basic drum loop. It's already not that groovy, but I'm gonna focus on 2 very important things, and those are the sample selection itself and the placement of those samples. So you wanna be choosing high quality samples for deep progressive music, usually pretty clean, punchy, not over processed, and then you wanna place those samples in an appropriate way that's going to make it super catchy and super groovy. The first example of this is this drum loop already sounds kind of stale. If I actually add in an open hi-hat, it's going to slightly increase the energy and make it feel just a little bit more groovy. This is because the original hat here is very sharp and it just feels very cut and dry, where the open hat adds a nice tail end and makes it feel like it flows a bit better. So now the placement of sound. So I have a percussion sound right here, very simple percussion. Just cutting out some of the lows and highs and adding a bit of reverb. The placement of the sound is very important as well. You want to place it somewhere where it's going to feel super catchy and groovy, and usually the more simple the idea, the better. Since this is my first percussion, I'm just going to keep it super simple, and I'm not going to fill up too much of the space because I'm adding multiple layers after this. Very simple. Let's listen with the kick. So to get these simple grooves, you can just listen to your drum loop and just think what would sound catchy and groovy there. Keep it super simple. What helps me is if I tap or hum or just think about it in my head. And worst case scenario, you can always just draw in your own MIDI first using maybe 16 inside the grid and just see if what you're adding actually adds value to the loop or if it makes it a little bit less groovy. That still sounds pretty good, but I want to get rid of these and I want to just use the simple, more broken up loop before I add in my secondary hooks. Secondary groove and hooks. These are going to be complementary to the first groove. And if you find that you're adding these in and they're not adding more groove to the track, it feels like it's pulling it back and it's not as interesting, then you want to change that sample or change that placement of the sound. It should be adding value to your drum loop and it should be complementing the main groove. So I'll turn on my percussion 2 here. Another just percussion sound, nothing special. And I'm placing that here and here. Very simple. I'm actually playing it over top of the kick, which is something I find some producers try to avoid, actually layering up multiple percussion instruments, but it can actually make the sound feel more dynamic and add a wider variety because you have 2 of the same samples playing over and over, but then you have them layered up, creating a different timbre of that same percussion instruments. I'm going to add a 3rd percussion here, and then I'm going to add 1 more after that. The 3rd one is the clave, which is very popular among progressive house. And what I've done here is actually waited until the second half of the loop to add it in. The first half of the loop only has these ones. These percussions are only in the first half of the loop, the first 2 beats. But the third and fourth beat of the loop have the clave, and this is called call and response. The first half of the loop, or the left side of the loop, is going to play one instrument or one sample or idea, and then on the second, it's going to kind of respond by playing something that you would think might be from the first, maybe repeat it, but it's going to be different. And this is a really good way of making it feel more dynamic and interesting because it's going to break up the loop even more. Very common to hear these types of percussions in progressive music, and I'm guilty of using these. I absolutely love them. This is a good time to mention that this should be tuned properly to the key of your track. So if you are using instruments with pitch, you want to make sure that they are actually tuned to the key of your track, using EQs or tuners to find the key and then transposing it so that it fits in the right key of your track. The last percussion I'm going to add is from a drum loop, actually. So this is where I want to mention that it's a great idea to grab drum loops from sample packs, throw them into your track, and try to grab different sounds from them. I absolutely love the beginning of that. I think it's a great way to complement this percussion loop even more. So I've just cut that out and grabbed just the beginning and then faded it out. It just adds some depth to the loop as well. Number 3 is going to be swing, and swing is basically very similar to groove, but it's about kind of getting off the grid a little bit, making things feel a little bit more loose, a little bit more realistic, humanized, and less robotic and rigid. It really elevates your track to feeling much more professional, just adding some simple swing. I'm actually going to show you a really good example of what swing is adding in our tracks. Going into the shaker here, I've pushed all my velocity back to where it was at the starting point, and it sounds really bad. So to add swing to this, I'm going to follow this pattern of low, medium, high, medium, and I'll duplicate that over. And now listen to how much better it sounds. Combine that with some sidechain compression from the kick to add even more of this swelling groove. And that is the power of swing. We are flowing now, and it feels much more interesting to listen to than it did when it was just flat across with the velocity. Combining that with our hats now, it feels more interesting and more professional. The first thing I'm going to add swing to is the different layers that I have inside of my hats. In here, I'm going to add swing by just slightly offsetting these just by a little bit. And I'm going to do this to all the instruments here. Maybe move this one over a little bit, this one back a little bit. And it's just going to make so both layers of that hi-hat sound a little bit different. One layer will be coming in a little bit later, one will be coming in sooner, and it just makes it feel more realistic and humanized. Another thing we can do to add a bit of swing is actually change the velocity of the sound. So I can move this up and down like this, maybe move this one down a little bit. And each of those hits is going to be a little bit different. I'll do that with the claps, maybe move one a little bit left, a little bit right. Next thing I'm going to do is actually add a second layer of shakers. So on top of just moving around the velocity and the placement of the sounds, it's actually really swingy to add a bit of variation to the different layers that you have. So I have this shaker here that sounds like this. It's much different than the first shaker that I have. And I'm going to duplicate over that MIDI information. Maybe turn it down a little bit. And then I'm going to grab a groove pool. So I can click this little symbol here, grab the groove pool, right click, browse groove library, and open up one of these Logic 16 swings. So I can take a listen to how the groove actually sounds. Maybe a little bit higher. This number here is how much it's going to influence the groove and the swing. So I'm going to drag and drop that onto the MIDI clip. And if I click on this commit button, it's actually going to commit to the MIDI clip, and you'll be able to see what it's changing. So we'll look here. You can see that it's moved over quite a bit. Added that nice amount of swing, but I feel like it's too much, so I'm going to Control Z. Let's go down to maybe 30%. And that's better. I don't need to hit commit. That's just to show me what's actually being committed to. Another thing I'm going to do to add swing is has effect. So I can go up here and go to the has, drag and drop that in. And if you don't know what has effect is, it's basically a stereo delay from left to right or right to left between 7 and 40 milliseconds. So I can grab the has effect, throw this on my shaker, and listen how much wider this sounds. especially if you're wearing headphones, you're really going to hear that those shakers feel very far and wide. This delay of 20 milliseconds also adds a bit of depth to the sound, and it makes it even further off the grid, which makes it even groovier and swingier. I've already added swing by moving some of the layers inside the grid and by adding some stereo delay, which is offsetting them even more. But you can also use drum loops or percussion loops that are going to add a lot of swing by continuously being off the grid. Number 4 is ear candy and movement. So this is really something that's going to elevate your loop. You may already be familiar with what I've done already, but this is something that I always do in my tracks and it always sounds awesome. You just have to make sure you choose the right samples. The ear candy, I've already added the has effect up here, which sounded great, but I want to add something that is probably not what you're thinking, and that is to grab percussion loop inside one of your sample packs. This is what mine sounds like. It's not going to fit the vibe of the track at all. But what I'm going to do is actually filter out a ton of that and add some processing to make this a really interesting sound. So I'm using what I call the vocal looper. For download on my Patreon, it is a filter delay with a bunch of saturation and some more filtering. And basically it's just adding a ton of delay to this. 3 different delays, and it's creating this super wafty, interesting sound. It sounds really cool. It's also adding swing because it's kind of off the grid, and listen how much value this adds to the track. So obviously it's adding a ton of that mid presence. It's filling up a lot of the empty space, and it's super catchy and swingy. Sometimes you get lucky and these loops just sound great by adding delays and filters and things on them, but sometimes you have to try a few different loops for it to work. But if you don't have the vocal looper, you're not a patron, that's fine. I'll show you a really quick thing that you can do. Just add a couple delays. A filter delay works really well because it actually is 3 layers of delay. Change the settings a little bit, and then an auto filter. And the auto filter, turn on the LFO, bring it down. And try that. Right? Quick and dirty, but that still sounds pretty cool. And if you try this with different sounds and different layers and loops, you get different ideas. And it's a really great way of adding some really unique value to your drum loops. This would be a great time to remind you that you can download the project files in the link in the description below, which links to my Patreon, where you can download a bunch of other Ableton projects as well. Another idea for some ear candy. This is a great way of adding depth into your drum loop. And again, filling up some of those empty gaps, which makes the drum loop feel much more rolling, much more full and vibey without adding too much to your track. So again, just grabbing a drum loop. Won't sound good with the track. It's just too busy, there's too much going on. But if I turn this down really far and just get a little hint of that, and EQ out most of the lows and the highs, I just get this nice kind of textural bottom sound that's very quiet, but it's just complementing the drum loop a little bit, filling up that empty space. This is so easy to do, and it's so effective a lot of the time. You can, of course, make these loops yourselves. Like this one is just a percussive sound with some delay on it, but this is a really fast way of doing it. Just grabbing loops that are already processed for you and processing them further, making them fit within your song. Little subtle hints of these sounds that your ears pick up on make them super interesting and have a lot of depth. They are what really elevates your track to be much more professional. Number 5 is going to be mixing, and there's a few things that I'm going to cover here that are pretty quick but very important to getting that nice punchy full sounding drum loop that gives you that professional quality. The first 2 things I'm going to talk about are saturation and transient shaping. The saturation is actually going to squish the sound a little bit, but it's going to give a little bit more power to the sound, a little bit of harmonic content, and make it feel fuller and brighter and louder. Transient shaping is similar to compression, where it controls the dynamics, but we're going to make things either less punchy or more more punchy. And in this case, I want them to be just a little bit punchier to really crack through that mix and feel really powerful. For this, I'm going to be using the Virtual Mix Rack by Slate Digital, which is this video's sponsor. The All Access Pass for Slate Digital actually gets you over $7,000 worth of pro plugins for any genre. And then you have compressors, you have tuners, reverbs, distortion, de-essers, thousands of audio samples. There's so many things that you get with this. There's even some synths and presets that you get with the All Access Pass. All this for only $9.99 per month. I've been using it and I definitely recommend you use it too. The Slate Digital has this virtual mix rack, which emulates and is influenced of a lot of old school gear. It's really cool to look at, brings you back into the analog era, and it has so many different things that you can use inside this mix rack. There's a ton of them that I haven't even touched yet, but Revival is a really great one. It's a saturation or a enhancement tool that is going to bring up the brightness and the mid areas of our sound. So I'll start with that first, just pushing up that high end with the shimmer and a little bit of the low mids with the thickness on the drums, and let's hear how that sounds. So a little bit of saturation can make your sounds feel just a little bit higher quality. And then going on to the transient shaper, this is really cool because it makes it feel super punchy and dynamic by boosting up the transients, or if you like, you can reduce them, but I want them to be more powerful. I'm going to push them up. So my hi-hats are punchier, my mids and lows are also punchier, but I don't really want those to be punchier right now because they already feel very present in the mix. So I'm going to adjust the focus bar here. So I bring that up. I'm actually only going to focus on the higher frequencies. So let's take a listen to that. And now I don't have that low mid crunch that I'm getting from boosting the transients of those lower frequencies. I can just focus on the higher ones. Next, I can go to the sustain, and this is actually really interesting. You can boost the sustain of the transient. So if you want your instruments to have a longer sustain, which will make them feel a bit more full, you can boost up this sustain knob. It just kind of like compresses the sound a little bit, almost like a glue compression. I've dialed the mix to about 60%. When we're mixing our drums into progressive house like this, the hi-hats and the high end is usually really bright and loud, and you want to feel like you're listening to your hats are in the center of your ears right here. So if you're wearing headphones, you should feel like those hats are right beside you, going directly into your ears. That's the best way I can describe it. Knowing that, let's listen before and after how this sounds with transient shaper in the context of the mix. So without the transient shaper and revival, the drums actually start to sound a little bit dull and a little bit farther back in the mix. One last mixing tip, and then I'm going to show you the thing that I promised you at the beginning of the video, which you're going to learn is going to bring you up to a more professional producer. So for the drums, I'm putting all of my drum tracks into one return channel. Of course, you should be doing this individually, putting in the right amount for each drum into the return track. I'm just saving time by putting the whole thing into my return track. And then I want to show you the pre-delay. So this is the amount of space before the original sound and when the reverb comes in, and this is often overlooked. It's set to 2.5 by default, but you should be pushing this up to at least 30 milliseconds for most drums to get a nice punchy drum coming through before the reverb actually starts to muddy up the original sound. It just allows for those drums to punch through a little bit harder before the reverb comes in and muddies it up. It's kind of hard to hear, but try to focus on the distance between the original sound and when the reverb comes in. So finally, we're at the best tip I have for the entire video, and that is to use reference tracks, but not in the way you might think. I actually use reference tracks like this. My favorite tracks of artists or my older tracks that I'm really happy with how the drums turned out, and I use an EQ and a utility to really hone in on the specific areas of frequency that I want to hear in the track, because it's very distracting to listen to a track in its full form. If I use this EQ and just cut everything up to about here, I can really focus on what's happening in the top end of the mix. And then I back off until I start to hear the instruments that I want to focus on. Now it's easier to hear the different drum instruments that might be hard to hear if I'm playing the whole track. The other thing that I like to do is actually put this into mono, so I'm getting rid of any of the stereo imaging that's in the song. And it just really lets you hone in on those drums specifically to learn what the producers are doing in their tracks. This was a huge game changer for me. I was struggling so much with my shakers and percussion loops, and being able to listen to my favorite producers and really focus on the top end of their tracks or other areas of their tracks using this exact same technique really helped me understand what I was doing wrong in my tracks. Since you're done, why not check out this video right here that YouTube thinks that you'll like based on your algorithm.